Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to our colleagues and friends and other time zones around the globe. I'm Joyce Hope Scott, president of the Boston Pan-African Forum, and I want to welcome you today to Boston Pan-African Forum's 11th annual Fall International Pan-African webinar. Our exciting webinar today is Spotlight on Haiti, Cuba, and Pan-African crisis, the Pan-African crisis in the Caribbean. This is an event organized in collaboration with the Department of Africana Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston and the African, Caribbean, and Community Development Center at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. From its earliest inception as the Boston Support Group for Trans-Africa in the 1970s, the Boston Pan-African Forum has been an organization committed to the principles of Pan-Africanism and reparative justice. In furtherance of its Pan-Africanist agenda, the Boston Support Group for Trans-Africa formed formally to the Boston Pan-African Forum in 1997 with the then Honorable Secretary General of the United Nations, Dr. Kofi Annan, delivering opening words of congratulations and encouragement. Boston Pan-African Forum featured also the first formal gathering of African Americans who had served the US as foreign ambassadors. Boston Pan-African Forum's alliance with UMass Boston extends back to these early days and has gone forward since its founding. Over the years, together, BPAF and UMass Boston's Africana Studies Department and Center for African, Caribbean, and Community Development have sponsored numerous joint programs and facilitated academic forums and advocacy activities of interest and importance to the local, national, and international Africana communities. While the fight for restorative justice for chattel slavery and dispossession of African-descended people goes back to the 18th century in the Caribbean, we note that America's imperialist concerns in the Caribbean, in Cuba and Haiti in particular, go back to the 19th century, beginning in the 1850s over whether to seize Cuba as a new slave state, and continuing later with incursions into Cuba, and in 1898 to protect US interests and to reportedly avenge the destruction of the battleship, the USS Maine. Americans who have never had much of a historical memory have tended to see these ongoing conflicts with Cuba as one of many proxy conflicts against communism's global spread. But in truth, it's a story a full century older about clashing empires and struggles over state sovereignty. As for Haiti, over the past 200 years, the United States has played a prominent role in the economic and political activity in Haiti. The US's refusal, first of all, to recognize Haiti as and incursions later into the country is a fact little known by Americans, but of significance for a candid assessment of the current crisis in Haiti's long struggle to develop as an economically strong sovereign nation. The Boston Pan-African Forum and the University of Massachusetts at Boston have also maintained a consistent presence in the Pan-Africanist activities that aim at furthering the goals of the United Nations International Decade of African People of African Descent by their participation in various levels of activities with the United Nations High Council on Human Rights and the overall goal for this decade of African people going until 2024. Representatives of the University of Massachusetts and Boston Pan-African Forum were involved in the International Network of Scholars and Activists conference called Returning to the Source, the Future of Reparations and Restorative Justice, which was held in Porto Novo, Republic of Benin in September of 2018. This conference resulted in the creation of the Porto Novo Declaration and called upon African states to join with civil society to formulate policies and establish operational committees to advocate for the claim of reparatory justice that the diaspora is advocating. This declaration was signed by all of the royal kings of Porto Novo at that time and has been used by different agencies to push forth the agenda at the United Nations. So you're welcome again to engage with us. Thank you for coming with this event, which continues our ongoing commitment to Pan-Africanist visions of redress, repair, and restorative justice for African descended people. We begin this event, first of all, though, with the long-standing African tradition of honoring our ancestors, imploring their blessings for success as we proceed. So I will ask Dr. Tony Vandermeer of the University of Massachusetts Africana Studies Department to please lead us in this moment of praise.
Thank you, Dr. Scott, Hope Scott, and thank you for your leadership with the Pan-African Forum. Also thanks to Dr. Jimidari Kumar from the Africana Studies Department, who also co-sponsored this, as well as for Yvette Modestine, who is moderating today's program. Today, as we share space together, we must thank those who came before us, as well as acknowledge them. Regardless of how overwhelming and fraught our lives may be, their sacrifices have made it possible for us to be here. The world must never forget the importance of Africa and the gift of life to civilization. We have to remain conscious of Africa's importance and our ancestors who gave us the gift of language, of math, of science, of technology, and a system of knowing to be used for humanity. We have to honor our ancestors from antiquity. We have to honor our ancestors who had to deal with the colonizations of their various groups. We have to honor the ancestors who endured the horrific Middle Passage, Ma'afa. We have to honor our ancestors who toiled the land in the various Caribbean islands in the United States and in South America. We have to remember that we are the hope of the dreams that they had, and we have to call on the spirit of their love and their resiliency. We call on our ancestors to help us come forth with solutions on how we can address the crisis that we are in, particularly as it relates to Haiti, particularly as it relates to Cuba, in terms of those vultures of capital development. We honor our mothers, we honor our fathers, and that we call on them, we call on their spirits to help us find some clarity as to how we can work together to resolve these issues. Iba ba ba, tofu ashe o. Iba ba ba, tofu ashe. Ashe te fun wala loyo. Iba ba ba, tofu ashe. Iba ye tofu ashe o. Iba ye tofu ashe. Ashe te fun wala loyo. Iba ba ba, tofu ashe. And I pour water to the ancestors of our mothers, of our fathers, their mothers and their fathers, to those who are known, to those who are unknown, and to bring their spirit into this conversation as we move forth, to look for solutions to deal with the crisis in Haiti and the crisis that exists in Cuba around the US embargo. Ashe. Ashe.
Ashe.
Ashe. Thank you so much, Dr. Vandermeer, for the blessings and invoking the ancestors for us. And we have permission to move forward now that we've given them respect first. I want to take this moment of great pleasure to present Dr. Jimidari Kamara, colleague and the associate with Boston Pan-African Forum for so many years in pulling together these programs along with Yvette Modestin and Dr. Vandermeer and others in the department who are not here right now. Dr. Kamara will introduce us to this webinar, the theme for today, say more about the UMass Boston's initiative generally for social justice reform. And I thank you, and please listen to this outstanding speaker and our beloved colleague at the University of Massachusetts. Thank you so much, Dr. Kamara.
And thank you very much, Dr. Hope Scott. It's a pleasure for me to help to introduce our program today, the 11th Annual Boston Pan-African Forum. This is a series that the Africana Studies Department and the Center for African, Caribbean, and Community Development have hosted with the forum, focusing on issues of Africa and Africa's diaspora that have impacted our lives, our communities, both here as well as throughout the diaspora and on the African continent. We've had a variety of themes and topics over the years that have been linked to the question of arts, culture, political, social, and economic development and underdevelopment in our communities. And today's topic is really very salient for us here in the greater Boston area and throughout the African world, given the impacts and implications of the crises in both Haiti and Cuba on our local community in Boston and the linkages that it has in throughout the Caribbean. I am particularly pleased today with the panelists who will be sharing their insights with us and our ability then to have a collective conversation around the topics that we are finding most salient with regard to the impacts of US imperialism on these relationships and the local community right here in Boston. One of our speakers today, I wish to point out, has had a particularly close relationship with UMass Boston. As one of the early graduates of our public policy program here at UMass Boston, I have to do this, Dr. Kantab, and appropriately introduce you in that context. Dr. Kantab received his PhD from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and went on to serve as the associate director of the Trotter Institute before taking up his current post, and he will be more formally introduced in that regard. But we're very pleased to have you here on the panel. And prior to even receiving his PhD degree, Dr. Kantab served as the executive director of the Haitian Studies Association, which was based in our department for nearly 2 decades, and has long been involved with the Haitian community here and internationally. Of course, the concerns of the Haitian community are very important to us at UMass Boston, since Boston houses the 3rd largest Haitian community in the country. And those things that impact the Haitian community, both historically and in a contemporary fashion, impact all of us and have had direct implications for the development and or consequent underdevelopment of our community. Additionally, Dr. Vandermeer, who led us in libations, has helped us through our department develop and expand our historical relationship with Cuba. It was under Dr. Vandermeer's leadership that a group of students from the University of Massachusetts sailed on the Amistad ship into Havana Harbor. And it was through this program, initiated through the Africana Studies program, that we began to build a bridge that he has continued to expand and has been able to facilitate the linkage with Dr. Vasquez Perez, who will be speaking with us today. We're very honored to have her join us in this conversation. It is also equally as important for us that as we have an exchange in conversation, that you participate through the chat. It will be open for you to contribute your questions so that we can facilitate dialogue and expand the conversation. And of course, our um, local contributor to the conversation, who has had a wide range of experience, both in his grounding and work that he has done in the Boston community, as well as internationally. Louis Elisa will be joining us and will be appropriately introduced by Miss Yvette Modestin. Ms. Modestin has been the moderator for our programs in the past. Many of you will know her from the work that she has done as the founder and executive director of Encuentro Diaspora Afro. She is an outstanding leader in our community and the work that she's done in the grounding within our community. She serves as an ambassador in Panama from the Rastafari community there, as well as serving on the National African American Reparations Commission. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you the moderator for our panel today, Ms. Yvette Modestin.
Thank you, Baba Jamadari. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos. Happy Friday. What a wonderful way to close out the week in community and in solidarity. One of the things that I want to put out the vibration as we go into this dialogue is to see this as something that is about us. Even though we're speaking about Cuba and we're speaking about Haiti, it's about us. We are removing the borders in this conversation. So as you listen to the three speakers, is to think about how that extends into the US and how it affects us, how this conversation is important to us. That is the depth and the definition of Pan-Africanism, is that we are all deeply connected, and whatever is happening in Cuba affects those that are happening in Panama. Whatever is happening in Haiti is also, and I could say that as a Panamanian, that Panama is involved in what's happening in Cuba and Haiti because, Haitians are coming to those borders. So that conversation is a conversation that we all need to be a part of. I'm going to start first with Baba Alex to open our conversation. He is the program officer at the W. Kellogg Foundation. And like Baba Jamadari stated, he was here at UMass. And I have to say thank you, because one of the earliest, most powerful conversations that Encuentro Diaspora Afro has had in Boston was at UMass Boston, that you were a part of, which was a conversation between the Haitian and Dominican students, which kicked off our long-lasting conversation between these two large communities in Boston that have a very difficult history around policies, politics, identity, and race. So I'm really happy to have your voice in this conversation today. So each speaker will have 12 to 15 minutes to share. I'm going to start with Baba Alex, and then I'll go to Baba Luis Elisa, and then I'll go to Karina, who is joining us directly from Cuba. So we want to then close out with there. Please feel free to put questions as we go along so that we don't miss the essence of engaging those of us who are attending today into the conversation. And we will try to do our best to incorporate that as we go. So Baba Alex Kantav, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Yvette, and really a special thank you to Dr. Kamara. And I must admit, it's because of Jamadari Kamara that I got involved with UMass Boston. And this dated back to the old days of the Trans-Africa Forum, or the Trans-Africa, or the Boston chapter of Trans-Africa, and where I met Jamadari. And that was back in 1980. I don't know, Jamadari. It was a long time ago. I know, I'm not gonna say. And as a result of that commitment from Jamadari, and the Haitian Studies Association then moved from Tufts University to UMass Boston, and then me subsequently enrolled again because of Jamadari at the public policy PhD program and get my doctorate there and learn a whole lot, really learning from several members of the Trans-Africa chapter, which now became the Boston Pan-Africa Forum, just amazing, amazing people, amazing teachers. And I always say, for me, grew up, partly in Haiti and partly in New York. I got back to Haiti by way of the Black community. And there are very few people who understood what I meant by that. And one of them is the late Verve Clark, who was here in Boston and who passed a few years ago. It's really understanding the struggle of the African-American community as a young person growing up in Brooklyn, then let me understand the importance of Haiti and Haitian Revolution. So there are really 3 points I want to highlight about the role of Haiti as part of the African diaspora. One is the key point that Haiti was the first place where to affirm and confirm that Black lives matter. And because of that, Haiti is paying that cost. It's been paying the cost of that ever since, to have the audacity to actually say that Black lives matter. Mm-hmm. And that was back in 1804, with the beginning of the Haitian Revolution, and really around prior to that, 1791. So that's the first key point. Because of that affirmation, Haiti is paying that cost ever since. The second major point is that in Haiti, not only paying the cost continuously, but also had to pay France for its independence. So the question of reparation for Haiti is not even reparation, it's paying back what France actually extorted from Haiti. And Haiti is paying that cost ever since as well. And then the third point about this is there are the importance of the Haitian Revolution historically and then to the present day. There were 3 revolutions. And again, I'm going to begin that with an African proverb. And that African proverb is really, until the lion learns to write, history would always glorify the hunter. So therefore, there's a narrative around the Haitian Revolution that as long as we don't begin to write our own history, it's always glorifying the hunter. So for example, the Haitian Revolutions, or the 2 revolutions around that same time. One was the American Revolution, 1775, 1783, that created the US. But at the same time, it was about freedom in a very limited way. It was independence. Meanwhile, US still holds slavery. So that was the first kind of revolution. Soon after the US Revolution, you had the French Revolution, 1789, 1799. And that revolution was really around the issue of, so the US was around the issue of sovereignty, but yet maintaining slaves and colonies. So the third revolution, which is the French Revolution, was about citizenship or citizens' rights, but yet couldn't bring themselves to end or to speak against forcefully about slavery and colonization. And the third major revolution is the Haitian Revolution, 1791 and 1804. And that's almost the forgotten revolution, except for people like us. And it was the only revolution that then said no to slavery, no to colonization, and no human being has the right to own another human being. Okay? So that was the only revolution that then affirmed that everyone has, not only that Haiti did that, but Haiti also say any Black person who comes to Haiti is a free and a Haitian citizen. And that came in, Sir Hilary Beckers, which I know we all heard about, wrote a book on some of these issues. And when he quoted a part where there was a boat that was taken out of Jamaica with some African slaves or slaves on the boat, took the boat to Haiti. And, and the governor of Jamaica then wrote to the Haitian president and said, look, you have property of Jamaica, you need to return. The president wrote back and said, well, if you're speaking about the boat, we'll be happy to return it to you, or you can come back and get it. But if you're talking about the Haitian slave, the Haitian citizens, not slaves, who were on that boat, those are Haitian citizens, not slaves, and they don't belong to you. So that was the importance of Haiti in terms of the diaspora of that time. And then quick forward to understand the application of that. No countries recognize Haiti. If you look at what was going on in the Americas at the time, so slavery, so we're talking 1804. So slavery in the US kind of ended in 1862. In Cuba, 1886. In Brazil, 1888. So Haiti was alone in the hemisphere and was completely isolated as a result. So what does that mean for Haiti? For France to recognize Haiti, Haiti had to pay France 150 gold franc. And the equivalent of that today, and Haiti ended up paying about 100 million of that, which is the equivalent of 21 billion in US dollars today. Think about that for a second. Country that was completely isolated, not recognized by anybody, but yet had to pay France the equivalent of 21 billion today. To put that in perspective for you, Haiti's national budget today is less than 3 billion. Okay? So you're talking about the equivalent of 8 years, 7 years of the Haiti's paying his entire national budget to France. So a decade of that. Think about that for a second. The US did not recognize Haiti as an independent nation until 1862. And the Vatican did not recognize Haiti or send any ambassadors to Haiti, or what is called, there's a special word for it, this will come to me, not until 1860. We're talking 60 years later in some cases of isolation, exploitation, and extortion of resources. So what does that mean today? So Haiti is an impoverished nation today. So what's happening in Haiti currently, it's not a crisis, it's chronic. Those are chronic conditions, both in terms of international, particularly US policy, and lack of and misguided local leadership as well. So there are external and internal causes of what's going on in Haiti today. Fast forward, where are we? Haiti has been in a transition since 1986. 35 years in a transition from the Duvalier regime to where we are today. During that time, you had instability. There's been systematic disinvestment in all local institutions. That means government institutions, public institutions, higher ed institutions, which is a critical piece, and educational institutions, social, cultural, systematic disinvestment. In addition to natural disasters, 2 major earthquakes in 2 years. In 10 years. 2 major earthquakes in 10 years, countless hurricane storms, in addition to everything that's going on. So where are we today? Just in the past year, right? Not even past year and a half, maybe year and a half now, right? No parliament, there's no government. An assassination of a president, and an earthquake. So Haiti, and now the country is governed by gangs. literally. Gangs are now controlling the country. There's no parliament, there's no legitimate government, and there's no consensus among the key stakeholders in local leadership, including civil society. So there's no societal consensus as to where do we go from here. And again, I want to end by saying this is not a crisis. As you could see, it is a chronic situation, both in terms of poor local leadership, misguided foreign policy and international relations, particularly the US, and the rest of the region. So as a result of that, where are we now is basically chaos. No local government, no government entity that one can really, there's authority, but nobody's in control. Children are unable to go to school. Hospitals are closing because you cannot get fuel to the hospitals to run generators. So hospitals are closing. Children are unable to go to schools. Smallholder farmers that lives in rural areas are unable to get their products to local market because gangs control the transportation in the highways. A gallon of gas is now, you have to spend between $15 and $20 US for a gallon of gas. Local products, it's cheap because they cannot get them to market. And foreign products, extremely expensive. So this is where we are today. And again, that is with the result of chronic historical racism or racist practices against Haiti, historically. Because sometimes people forget that Jesse Helms, people forget people like Jesse Helms, US representative from North Carolina. He served in the US Congress until the 90s. We're not talking, we're talking a few decades ago, one or two, not that long ago. In his mission, he opposed any policy US regarding Haiti. Jesse Helms, US Congressman from North Carolina, I think North or South Carolina, and was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Very powerful committee, who's now Congressman Mix from New York is the chair of that, but for years, he controlled that and was adamant about, Haiti against any kind of progressive policy regarding Haiti. So that's the context of where we are today. And in the partnership, the importance of partnership with institutions like UMass and others, and to bring that issue in terms of reparation and repaying the debt that France owes Haiti. Again, just to close, when Aristide brought that issue up, I'm trying to remember, was it 96? I'm trying to remember the exact date. And within weeks, he was overthrown. Was gone. Yeah, but that issue needs to be back on the table. And
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Baba Alex. I want to just highlight a few things for us to keep in mind that you shared. One is that understanding Haiti also came from understanding the African-American experience, which speaks to what we're thinking of Pan-Africanism and removing the borders that folks need to keep in mind. Also, Black Lives Matter. You said it. Let's keep that today. Push out in the streets. The first people to say Black Lives Matter were those Haitian warriors, those Haitian African warriors, and we tend to forget that. And thirdly, keep in mind that whatever was happening in the world, this small, beautiful island gave freedom to anyone who landed there. whatever language they spoke, wherever they were coming from. If an African landed in Haiti, they were free. So keep that in mind. Haiti is not about just Haiti. Haiti is about us. And thank you for, whenever we talk about Haiti, we talk about, oh, it's been going on, it's going on, but now my new language is going to be, this is a chronic condition, historically chronic condition. But I want to pull one of the questions because it's something that you ended with. Should Haiti seek reimbursement from France? And if so, what should that look like?
The answer is yes. Because when you look at that's the impoverished part. When you think about, as I share, the Haiti's national budget today, think about, for example, Haiti is using its entire national budget for 10 years to repay France for its independence. What happened to the country? What happened to the economy? What happened to all services? That's basically paralyzing the government, the society for a decade. That's what this would mean. So yes, and I think, it's not about, people look at Haiti as a charitable case. We pay that money. And I think that's something that we need to be forceful and talk about and bring that up to the international arena. The unfairness of that. That's criminality. That's extortion. I think there needs to be some acknowledgement that that money need to be repaid to Haiti.
Thank you for that. We're going to move along to the next panel, and then I'll come back with a little bit more questions. One of our leaders in the streets of Boston, but a lot of folks don't know that he also does some transnational work, is Baba Louis Elisa, who's here from the Transformative Justice Coalition. And I know whenever you speak, Baba Louis, you put the context of in and out, and I'm sure you will do that for us today, so you have the floor. You're on mute.
Thank you, Dr. Modestine, and thank you, Baba Kamari, and thank you, Baba Tony Vandermeer, and thank you so much, Alex, Dr. Contabs, for this opportunity. I'm not lucky enough to be in the STEAM walls of academia, so I miss a lot of the context and content that makes up this process, but I've been lucky to be in the company of all of you at some time or another. And when you mentioned Trans-Africa, it just made my heart leap, because I remember that Dr. Johnson and Baba Kamari and the others, we came together in Boston. While people don't know, Boston set the pace for the actual liberation of South Africa through a simple decision that Dr. Kamari got a city councilor, keep that in mind, to put forward divesting the city of Boston of all of its holdings involving South Africa, that anybody doing business in the city of Boston could not have any economic holdings or interest in South Africa. And through that process, where our State Department and others were having difficulty to deal with this, when Dr. Kamari and Dr. Johnson were going to the counselors and getting arrested, we were able to say to the country, here's how we stop the United States from doing business without South Africa because of the funding that they were getting. And so when we said no bank, no school, Harvard, no company, anybody, if you want to do business in the city of Boston, you cannot be vested in South Africa. It was a very simple idea. And that's what makes this issue and discussion of Haiti so poignant at this point. Haiti had the audacity to be free, because when you talk to people, they talk to you in context of Haiti in the French. Haiti, this little country in the Caribbean, surrounded by the world's great powers, had not only the audacity to oppose the French, but they opposed the British. They opposed the British. They kicked them out of Port-au-Prince. They held it more for 5 years in battle in 1793. They beat the French, they beat the British, and they went and beat the Spaniards, the world's 3 greatest powers, and declared independence in a region of the world to which the United States had not even achieved its freedom from its colonial masters. In 1802, when Haiti was declaring its independence, the United States was still involved with the British. There were more than 5,000 Haitian sailors involved in the War of 1812 in the Great Lakes of New York, fighting with the United States on their behalf for that America be free. It was the audacity of this little nation to set a pace and frighten all these world great powers. The French, the British, and the Spanish, and then the Americans, because to have a country off this coast that would welcome people to their nation, and upon reaching the shore, that they become free, that could not exist when you have a slaveocracy that seeks to keep people in bondage, chattel, because of the color of their skin. And here's a nation that says, we're independent, we're free. They were a threat to the racism that engulfed the United States at that time, the America at that time. And so therefore, they had to be corralled. They had to be taken in. And so their short-lived independence and freedom was a collaboration of the world's powers saying, this little Black nation, how dare they? How dare they challenge the world's powers? Did not just challenge them, they actually beat them. And we got to keep that in mind, because that is the nexus of our understanding why today they are still being oppressed, why they're still keeping the boot on their head with this, reparations, which is enforced and supported. It's supported by the United States when they invaded in 1915. They went in and took over the country and its banks and said that they would impose and they would continue to pay the reparations. And why they continue to keep Haiti from reaching its sovereignty once again. The first reason is DNA, because it's in the DNA of a people to be free. They understand what freedom is because they were one of the first nations in this hemisphere to be free. And so that's frightening. And you got to understand, it's when you've had that freedom, when you understand what it is to rule your own nation, you have a totally different concept of the world around you. And they don't want that spreading. That's the challenge that they find in Cuba. That's what they find when Fidel comes in and he tells Batista, we're not going to continue to be the dumping grounds for American slavery in terms of prostitution and drugs and all the things that they couldn't do legally in the United States. They took it to Cuba. So Haiti and Cuba became the dumping ground for America's degradation. And when you fight back and say, I want to be free, it's not something that people are very comfortable with. And so we look at the history of Haiti, and we look at the history of Cuba, and we look at the fact that the Africans who are there fly in the face of all the things that people tell themselves, that Americans tell themselves about African people of African, about the diaspora. It's a contradiction that they can't live with. That's why they have to enslave them. That's why they have to invade them. That's why they have to keep them from standing up and reaching their full height again, because you can't continue to keep a nation, a people subjected to this type of thinking where they don't believe that they can rise above if they can see that there are nations that have risen above. There are people who have countries and nations. Reason we don't learn about African history and culture, why they want to keep pointing us to Europe, because once our young men and women learn that they have a culture of history, of growth, of economic development, they have to begin to think differently about what's going on in their communities. Every time we see an example of prosperity, it's always like a European example. Now they picked up some Asian example. There are 53 countries in Africa. You can find Black billionaires, people own airplane companies and oil companies, and they don't want you to see that image. They don't want African Americans to see that image. And they don't want you to be independent in your thought, word, or deed. In 1969, the Republic of New Africa here in the United States, a group of people came together and we said, we won't fight you for integration. We want our own place to go. We have some places in Mississippi and Louisiana that we can go and set up our own nation. It was met with such violence that the New Bethel Baptist Church in '69, as the Republic of New Africa came to form its own constitution, they were attacked as if we were foreigners or coming from some other place where they believed we would be, terrorists against America, to make sure that we never got this idea moving of independence. So Haiti is basically living through the challenge that they established themselves by having the audacity to be free. And so how is it maintained? It's maintained through our own ignorance in terms of us supporting activities and programs through the UNDP or USAID or international programs to say, we want to help Haiti. And then you look and see the fundamentals aren't done. When you look around and see what can and should happen, the fundamentals aren't there. The support that we could give them in terms of universities and programs and nonprofit groups that are working to make sure that they move forward and trying to recover, getting a foothold and a position in which they can begin to really build their nation. The politics, it's going to be a challenge. The gangs, they're supported, they're propped up. The same situation I saw back in Zaire back in '71. I see, here today, throughout this whole period of time, they cannot allow the independent nations of Africa, Haiti or Cuba, to realize their economic potential because they rape these nations. They take their resources. As they move into their independence, then these nations ask for their fair share for the resources that are being taken out. The glory of Cuba and the liberation of its people is the resistance they put up and continue to maintain. They show their steel and their stellar commitment to independence. Despite what the US has done, they've maintained the nation and pride. They did more than that. And that's what's important to remember. In the independence of Africa, particularly in Southern Africa, where I'm sitting in the shops in Lusaka, Zambia, dealing with people coming across the border from Angola. There were Cuban doctors and Cuban advisors who were helping the people be independent. When I'm sitting there, in Mozambique, in Dondo, and different places, there were Cuban advisors and people working with Frelimo and the other groups, explaining to them about independence. There were not too many nations that wanted to take that on. And that's the reason why the US fears independent, strong Cuba. Because if they will educate their people, they take a nation from 85% illiteracy to a nation that's almost 100% literate. That you can get a degree as a doctor. If you're willing to work, you can get advancement in education and science and business. They do not want that to happen. The Europeans do not want to see independent nations strong like this. And so Haiti still represents a threat to the European nations, because if you pick up the book and read, this nation beat, conquered, throughout, overcame the oppression of the world's greatest powers, then it sends a message that you too can be independent. My father's from a little country called Curacao, and they still consider themselves dependent on the Netherlands. I think it's exciting and very interesting that people still consider themselves, the vassals for European nations. Haiti shucked off those coils before Europeans in the Western Hemisphere knew what freedom was. So we're now at a point where we can, as a people here in the United States, in universities and colleges in different places, be of some resource and service. One, by committing to put people with skills and commitment to the independence and growth of Haiti into that environment. Having worked for FEMA for years, I represented them in the United States as a regional director and in NATO for 4 years. I know that we can and should give more assistance and support. There's no way that 10 years after an earthquake, the Capitol building, the president's estate should still be looming as a failure of leadership in that country. It's there for a reason. I know because when I look at everything else around us, we say, why don't they make these changes? Why don't they allow, why don't they have the water system? How is it possible without there being some committed and direct action to assure that they don't move forward, that you have the challenges that we're facing in Haiti at this moment? So the question for us in the diaspora is, how do we come together? How do we bring the African diaspora, all the nations of the AU, to our brothers and sisters here in this hemisphere, and we put the skills and resources that are available? If Nigeria has all this oil resources, if Tanzania has all of its resources, if Angola has the diamonds, in Uganda has, you know, the minerals that send spaceships into the heavens, why don't we begin to use that to help develop the strength and power that can be Haiti if we work together? Those of us living in the United States, we have to think about how we relate to the people in our leadership. And we must say to those in political positions, we must say to our president, we will not stand for a double standard, that you will not open arms for people coming from Afghanistan and coming from Albania and places like that, and then turn away the people whose nations you've been using, resources you've been using, bodies you've been using, because a lot of science, a lot of medicine, everything takes place in Haiti that we don't talk about what they provide in terms of human resources, other mineral resources, but how we can get them to say we have one standard and Haitians be treated with the same respect as any other refugee in any other situation. We can't criticize Europe and not taking African refugees trying to come across the Mediterranean Sea. And then when the Haitians come into our country, we treat them differently than anyone else. We cannot open arms for people coming from all over the world who are not being oppressed, who's not being challenged, whose nation, you know, we did not subjugate, and then say to Haitians who fought for our independence, War 1812, and served here in this country, Haitians in all ranks of our military, police officers, human services, teachers, and not say to them, we're going to give you that same respect. Basically, I'm saying that we have a job to, one, make the record clear, two, challenge our leaders to have the international community do exactly as you say. As Malcolm said, this is a human rights issue. To continue to pay reparations to France is a violation of that human right. Continue to not give Haiti the support that it needs and give money to independent organizations or CBOs and NGOs that are not doing what they're supposed to do. That's a challenge to our freedom as Africans in America. And we have the capabilities, resources, intellectual and human resources to do that. I work with Transformative Justice, but I am an actual part of the Black Emergency Managers International. And we've got representatives all over the world, particularly in the Caribbean. And we know that we can make some changes if our government is committed to work with us. And resources, we don't have to ask for resources if we get fair amounts of money for the resources they're taking out. That is one of the reasons why they don't want the nation to be independent, because they're still taking resources. The reason why the British went in, the French went in, you know, to take over the country is because Haiti is capable and has been producing natural resources that has fueled the economy of the United States for the last 300 years.
Thank you so much. Oof, that was loaded with information. Oof. But I want to repeat one of the questions that you posed to us, because I think it's a question that we need to be able to answer as we move through the conversation, is how do we come together as the African diaspora to address this conversation? So think of that as we move through the panel. And thank you, Baba Louis, for reminding us of how central Boston was to the whole South African piece. And I am not a community daughter if I don't bring her name into that conversation. Is Loretta Williams, who was a dear mentor, who was a part of that movement. So I want to honor what she did in that historical moment here. You also spoke, and we have one of our elder scholars in the space with us today, and I just want to give you an opportunity to answer that question real quickly before we move into Karina. And Baba Tangulisi is here with us, so welcome, Baba. And he posed a question that I think needs to be answered before we keep moving on. So could anyone further elaborate on the U.S. role in perpetrating Haiti's underdevelopment, especially institutions such as Citibank and the U.S. government? So either Baba Luis or Alex, if you want to touch on that. I wanted to answer that because that's specific to Haiti before we go on to Cuba.
Well, my understanding of U.S. banks, and I understand to be corrected, the invasion that took place in, I think it's September of 1915, was directly to take over the Bank of Haiti and to incorporate its resources and to manage its manufacturing and its natural resources that were coming out. And that to a large extent, they tied that into, I think, Bank of America, someone will have to correct me, and that to a large extent, they gave the control over to the US banks to make sure that everything that had to be paid out to the European nations was paid out, and that America would be able to get back whatever money. But please, that deserves correction.
Baba Alex, do you want to add?
No, I think I'm gonna say Lisa did explain it correctly, and I think it was basically U.S. went in there to protect U.S. business interests, and in so doing, and I think as Louis Delisa explains, took over the Haitian National Central Bank and its gold reserve resources to repay what they saw as again, it was around U.S. financial and business interests. And Citibank at the time was at the center of that.
Thank you so much. And another thing that just for us the audience to keep in mind, that this, we're talking also, we need to keep highlighting that this is a human rights issue. This is a human rights issue. This is a human rights issue, and it deserves all of our attention. We are still in the decade of people of African descent. You had a UN report that just came out that criticized the treatment of people of African descent, not only in this country, but around the world, and that there was a deep need for reparative justice to be done and faced for the people of African descent. And actually the tribunal that just happened also came out with a report that's saying that, the treatment of Africans and people of African descent needs to be addressed and continues today. Karina, ¿estás ahí? Lauren, could we bring?
Yes, I'm here.
Estás aquí. Ok, muy bien. ¿Está tu
Estoy escuchando.
traductora o quieres hablar y yo traduzco? ¿O lo vas a hacer en inglés y si te trancas, yo lo puedo traducir?
No, ok. Solo agradecer, ¿no? La oportunidad de estar y nada.
So Karina is actually joining
Estoy
us
aprovechando para
directly.
aprender entre todos lo que ponen.
directly from Cuba, and part of our human rights issue and our ability to seek our freedom and our liberation is through technology. And one of the things that she shared earlier is that the technology is not so strong, coming out of Cuba, which how it interferes here. So we will probably hear her talk here and there, but she's gonna go ahead and share, and I will try to do my best to translate for her. So she wants to say thank you and for the opportunity to be here, to listen, to learn, and to share.
Karina.
Okay, ahora sí, profe.
Sí, okay.
I'm listening.
Okay. This is a crisis that if anybody ever tried to WhatsApp or a message in Cuba, you would get this type of situation, which speaks to the role the U.S. is playing. If you remember, one of the things that happened was the U.S. was trying to say it needs to be, deal with more internet access and so forth. But it's the U.S. who's actually made it difficult for not only for us to communicate with Cuba, but also in terms of supporting people and family in Cuba with remittance and so forth.
That's right, that's right.
There you go. Go ahead, Karina, you can talk.
Okay, well, here in Guantanamo, we are trying to stand to enjoy together investigator of the territory, to start a role of collaboration and socialization of knowledge about the influence of African culture here in Cuba and in the Caribbean. So the department, we are trying to consolidate this Afro-Caribbean cathedral. Right now, we are trying to make a revolution in the Cuban Revolution, with an open dialogue. I don't know how to say that. Diálogo abierto.
An open dialogue.
Okay, the open dialogue about the perception of color discrimination here in Guantanamo and in Cuba, because besides the logros de la revolución,
the successes of the revolution, besides the successes of the revolution.
We still have some racial prejudice of an exclusion in some institutions that the project of the revolution do not recognize, but some people with their discrimination of the racial conscience discrimination are practicing here today. That's why we are starting this already the social nets and what is happening about the topic in the social nets like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and others. How the influences and the manipulation of the United States governments and the hostile politicals about Cuba and our system is paying some people, some counter-revolutionary anti-Cuban people are trying to manipulate the situation and exacerbar, o sea,
Exasperate.
Okay, exasperate the situation that is not the truth. So right now in the study we are doing right now is focus in that racial reflexion for the self-contradiction and the self-definition using in Cuba. and how what you call embargo and we call bloqueo is estrangulando. How can I say?
Is strangling, strangulating.
Okay, is strangulate strangulate the Cuban people, the families. What we are and the situation we are facing today with the internet is just a view of what the Cuban people facing in their quotidianity. So. So we are recognizing in our studies what Afro and Afro-Cuban means for the Cuban, and what are trying to manipulate that meaning today in the political and communicating world is against Cuba. So we are trying to connect with some researchers from your university, like the Professor Tony van der Meer and other one that I have the pleasure to examine today. So to
Intentionally. Intencionalmente,
okay.
intentionally.
To intentionate studies together, trying to how to say profundizar.
To deepen.
Okay, to make a deep study about the actual situation and the connection between what is happening in all Caribbean, in America, and also in particular in Haiti and Cuba, because the geopolitical ubication of Cuba and Haiti are strategies for the intention of domination in the America for United States governments, you know better than me. So and we suffer. So we are trying to keep that line of researchers and actually we are trying to profundize in the social migrant process developed in Cuba, in particular in Guantanamo, that have some looks that when inventing the things of what Afro are belonging to Black as well as the perspicacia.
The physique, the physique of the person.
As well as the perspicacia. Okay, please, porque esa cosa. To identity forms or discrimination manifestation or the forms of discrimination for color of the skin here in Guantanamo and in whole Cuba. That is just a pretext for the anti-Cuba groups that are trying to manipulate the situation. Enter the rebellisms of groups, of anti-racist groups with diverse integration, whose affiliation comes through irrespective of social ranks, school level, cost-reducing possession or political integration with various topical interests and modes to approach him. And in the other hand, such groups lead their priorities toward the reaffirmations of the beauty in the aesthetics, what's Black and Africa means for Cuban culture. We are studying that tribalism present the anti-racial dues that not mean it's not a new topic in Cuba. Since 18th century, we are trying and we are looking some documents and testimony that nos permite afirmar esto.
Yo voy a pararla un rato ahora, porque eso fue mucho. Déme preguntarle unas cuantas preguntas. Usted, habló, so Karina spoke about the revolution within a revolution. She's also speaking about the color discrimination that is happening in Cuba and the reconnecting with their African identity that her university is doing, and in a process of creating sort of an Afro-Cuban centralizing. Karina is at the Cátedra de Estudios Afro-Caribeños, so she's the chair of the Afro-Caribbean Studies Department at the University of Guantanamo. So she's speaking about the manipulation and the US manipulation from social media and how that is, getting into the conversation about anti-Blackness, which is so, appropriate with how the US deals with Black identity within Latin America that we fight on this end and then all over Latin America. And what she's saying to us is that is also an issue in Cuba around cementing Black identity. What does it mean to be Black? What does it mean to be African? And how do we self-define ourselves? So they're in a process of creating some work. They're working closely with Baba Tony around sort of the department creating a program that centers that, grounds them in that African identity. Because what has happened is that the revolution, what she said was so striking, a revolution within the revolution. So the revolution creative movement, but now this revolution is, this another layer of this revolution is cementing itself in its African identity and what it means to be Afro-Cuban.
And Yvette, but also the idea of that there is a counter-revolution coming from outside of Cuba, from the US, using Black Cubans and other people to try to alter the narrative. It's also important to say that the past several weeks that Karina and a cadre of other Cubans have had a very serious conversation about this very same question. She had people, Cubans who are in Switzerland doing work, and folks who are in Brazil, who are in Mexico, and across the whole island, even in, people from Jamaica that was there having this conversation. And it's very important because when you deal with the eastern part of Cuba, in Santiago and Guantanamo, and so they're right next to Haiti, right next to Jamaica, and so forth, and have a deep history of resistance of African people who fought for Cuban independence and sovereignty. And so this is why this is important in the work that she's doing and a cadre of folks who've been doing this for a while. But you wouldn't hear that from these folks in other places and doing this. And the work that Karina doing is very central to that with the cadre of other scholars that she's been working with.
Thank you, Baba, for pulling that together. Gracias, Karina. So I want to, open it up for folks for Q&A. I'm sort of the conversation, I think all of you mentioned it, and Karina sort of touched on it too, is that right now a Cuban can come to American land and be able to stay. And years back, the Washington Post had done an article about two Cubans that were friends in Cuba and came to the US around the same time. One was identifying himself as an Afro-Cuban and the other one was not. And when they interviewed them for this article, they had both been in Miami for the same amount of time and had very different experience. And the clear difference in their experience was that one was Black and one was self-identifying as just Cuban. A Haitian can land on American land and immediately gets taken to ICE and gets arrested and turned back. So that's how deeply rooted the US policy is. It's not that now countries are struggling with how many Haitians are trying to get in and what they can do to best serve them. But at least they're trying to figure that out, even though some countries, sadly, like my own leader, are turning folks back. But someone can get here and not even be able to stay. And also, one of the things that that we heard is how strategic, Karina mentioned it, strategic Haiti and Cuba are to the US's control of the hemisphere by having power in these two places. So, they sound so small. When my first time, doing the work and going to Haiti, I'm like, oh my God, people are fighting over this very small island. And then, people have this, there's a very different experience between Santo Domingo and Haiti, and people speak of them as two very separate things when all you have to do is cross the street to when you're going from Santo Domingo, Haiti. It is literally a bridge or a street, like crossing Blue Hill Avenue to get from Haiti to Santo Domingo, which people, fail to understand. And then, when you think about Cuba and Cuba's positioning when it talks about education, but this is not only what is happening in Cuba, and we're not talking about this other space that's also going through this, but Venezuela is also an extension of this same conversation around how capitalism, imperialism plays itself out in other countries, and how, those other countries. And it also is something for those of us from the US, is that when we're seeing people coming to the US, is to understand that the migration to the US is not just out of nowhere, is the fact that the US is already in those home countries and pushes people to then migrate, to a certain extent to the US because of the US role in their own country's demise. And Cuba and Haiti are two places that can speak to that. So I want to open it up to Mama Joyce, Baba Tony, Baba Alice, Baba Louis, Baba Jemadari. What are you thinking as we've heard this very specific, we've heard the history, we had the dates, 1804, 1862, that the US recognized it. We have the human rights violations, we have the reparations issue, we have the Black Lives Matter issue. So where are we, where are you sitting right now, and how do we move this conversation out? And anyone can jump in.
Well, I think it's appropriate time right now, because as I indicated when I made my introduction, that this is the International Decade of African people of African descent. This is the United Nations declared decade. And my question has always been, what are we going to do during this decade? Are we going to sit and wait for people to do things for us, or what will be our legacy? We as African descended people on the continent, as well as here in the diaspora, what are we going to do? And I think that's up to us. We pointed out all these problems, the gangs in Haiti, or the other kinds of things that exist. We have the ability to address these issues, and we need to do that ourselves. We can't wait for somebody else to do it for us. One of the things that Boston Pan-African Forum has always done is to underscore that this is a Pan-African issue. Okay, today it's not the 1900s, the first Pan-African Forum, a conference in London that Du Bois and others looked at, talking about the issue of the 20th century, the color line is still the color line. The issue of the 21st century is the color line, with all of the capitalist and imperialist controls that were always there. Listen, this goes back to slavery. I pointed that out in the beginning. Haiti as well as Cuba. Don't think that they were separate events that took place. They were all connected. The investment is still the same. That which profits the companies of Europe and the United States during that time period are still of interest today. And we need to do our homework to figure out what that is, just as we did with the Free South Africa movement. Which buttons do we need to push? And we decided that the buttons to push for that was to divest. So what is it that we need to do now as as people of a family, the family of African descended people here in the diaspora, what do we need to do to push the buttons to move this forward? Because it's our day and we cannot leave this decade without having accomplished something constructive with these two nations.
Well,
I mean,
I would
it-
say,
go ahead,
this is what I would say is that we got to take it back to the streets, period. Right? I remember, going on Thanksgiving to Washington, D.C. with Dick Gregory and other folks when we were dealing with Trans-Africa, talking about what's happening in South Africa. And so I think now that, we have to do what Alex has said is that in terms of Haiti being the first Black Lives piece, we have to activate that mentality with what Black Lives Matter is doing now. That we have to begin to put pressure on the US government around its blockade on Cuba, about its treatment of Haiti, and that we have to start going, and it don't have to be a DC, but we have to raise the profile to a national level and say that this is unacceptable and it's outrageous. And so I think that we have to begin to work with Boston Pan African Forum, with Joyce and other networks around this country to raise this profile. And connected to not just the global, but as Jim Adar would frame as the global, what's happening locally, what's happening nationally as African people, and not just in the diaspora, in the continent. We have to strengthen the organizations to put political pressure on the state. We're in the belly of the beast. And so many of our African brothers and sisters in the Caribbean and in Africa rely on us. And so we have to realize that we've also been attacked. When Lisa talks about the Republic of New Africa, he's citing an important history of how people were attacked and wiped out, and how our leaders were assassinated and people are. We still got people in prison today. We got people who are in prison in Cuba, who are in exile in Cuba because they was in prison here and they escaped to Cuba as seen as a palenque. We have to raise our activism and we have to take it to the streets, and we have to appeal to the political forces locally, statewide and nationally, to tell them to get their knees off of our necks.
Thank you, Baba Tony. So we have, a question, and please feel free to put the questions either in the chat or in the Q&A part. And someone wrote, Maeve Cassidy wrote, is Haiti anti-Cuban? Where's the anti-Cuban coming from? Well, I will say Haiti is not anti-Cuban because they've helped each other over the years. The anti-Cuban, in this conversation is the US. Am I wrong? To my elders, I'm posing that question.
Karina, you want to answer that?
Sí, me lo puede traducir porque entendí solo parte. Que si el tope, el centro del
Sí, no, la persona está preguntando quién es anticubano. Y mi pregunta, si Haití es anticubano, y yo dije, no, Haití no es anticubano. Porque Haití y Cuba han tenido una relación. So, ¿quién es anticubano en esta conversación? Y yo dije que es los Estados Unidos.
Pero no los Estados Unidos. La política de Estados Unidos e incluso la diáspora cubana que está en Estados Unidos y que quiere instalar el capitalismo en Cuba.
Yeah. So her response is the anti-Cuban.
Es lo anticubano.
The anti-Cuban is the U.S. policies that the U.S. has towards Cuban, and the Cuban diaspora is anti-Cuban because they want to put in capitalism within the Cuban structure. So those are the folks that
that is part of government. That's part of private interest, and some of the right-wing Cubans who are in Miami, who's creating that, as well as some of the Cuban scholars who are getting funded in their ways to address this question.
So anyone else, any other questions? So one of the things, go ahead, siga, Karina.
A ver, ya se ha extendido las conexiones, ya no es solo Estados Unidos. Se está aprovechando también la diáspora cubana instalada en Europa para apoyar toda la política hostil de Estados Unidos hacia Cuba e incluso generar enfrentamientos inexistentes entre el pueblo cubano de color negro y otros, y exacerban situaciones inexistentes sobre discriminación por color de la piel o hacia afrodescendientes, que en Cuba esto, si bien no ha terminado totalmente por personas que todavía son racistas, e institucional y estructuralmente en nuestro país, esto es algo penalizado por la ley. Aquí en Cuba la Constitución protege a las personas todas, sin distinción. Desde siempre, desde el triunfo de la revolución, eso cambió en Cuba. ¿Ve? Entonces ahora se está aprovechando la crisis que por la pandemia de COVID-19 económicamente se ha creado en el país, y todas las barreras, las medidas que ha impuesto el gobierno de Estados Unidos, primero de Trump y ahora con Biden, hacia nosotros para no poder acceder al mercado internacional, y está buscando esa ayuda de aquellos cubanos que nunca han querido realmente, que no comprenden las bondades o los logros del socialismo en este país, y están tratando de crear, desestabilizar la paz interna en el país, cosa que hasta ahora no ha tenido grandes impactos.
Yeah, so Karina was sharing that also the anti-Cuban is not just the Cubans in Miami or in the US, but the Cubans that are in Europe that are using this crisis now because of the pandemic and the impact of the embargo and the blockade on Cuban, and now with this crisis are using an opportunity to continue to exasperate the crisis. But one of the things that she shared is that in the Cuban Constitution, it states to protect against discrimination and racism. But there's still that layering that happens within Cuba, and it tends to be the colorism that exists is between the darker skinned Cubans versus the lighter skinned Cubans that you will see. So they're really trying to address that. But a lot of the outside forces are creating a lot of the tension and the crisis that continues because pre 45 and Biden, when Obama sort of opened it up, things were starting to at least shift a little. And then, Trump 45 takes in and the COVID happens, and, you feel it even more as it relates to the embargo and versus the blockade, So that's what Karina was sharing. Any other thoughts as we move forward?
Yes, I
we still
have
time. Go ahead, Baba Jamadari.
Yes, I have a comment, and picking up from two of the questions that were posed in the chat, and bringing some of the conversation back home to us here. The issue was raised given the profile that had been presented both by Alix and Lewis regarding Haiti and now its current situation, and the control on the ground in that space of local gangs, seemingly. The question was raised, one, whether if we agree that in fact there needs to be a repayment for that extortion that has occurred over 2 centuries, in that environment, is it possible to bring the leadership that is randomized and based on neighborhood and community kind of control through these gangs together? Is that possible to have any kind of intermediary force to bring those together to help build this consensus that Alex was speaking to? Secondarily, I would want to raise the question now, the implications for us here with our community now having had a public hearing on the question of repair and reparations. How do we now begin to bridge and build consensus within our own community, across the Haitian community and the Jamaican community and the African-American community and other communities of African descent here, to mobilize with our allies to push that question forward concretely in the context of the Boston community? So it's 2 parts.
I'll give a crack at it first, Damadari. And I think regarding in terms of the gangs, that's a tricky piece. It's very complex for a number of reasons. There is criminality. And it's not as if you're dealing with groups that have an ideology. So there's criminality involved. And you're dealing with, there's different components of that criminality. One, you have gang leaders who were paid, hired, supported by the business elite and the political class for their own benefits. And so you have that degree of criminality on the leadership. And I think there has to be a different response in terms of that. In terms of the members of the gangs, what I would call the rank and files, those are deprived. Let me give you an example, Jamida. You remember going to the airport. Mm-hmm. And for 10 years, over 10 years, I'm traveling to Haiti every month. So as you go into this road, we all take the same road, right? Coming from the hotel, going to that zone, and you've seen faces you begin to recognize. Okay? So we're talking over 10 years, you recognize these faces and they recognize, they recognize me. So they make eye contact. So what I've done over the years is always have some goods with me or US dollars, because I'm gonna go by these faces and see them. Among these people, there are two of them I recognize, I remember vividly. One was a young boy, one was an elderly woman. Now, that young boy must have been 10 or 12 years old at that time. Over 10 years, he's no longer 10 and 12 years old. He's now in his early 20s. Does he make eye contact or does he demand at this point? Does he ask or does he take? Because nobody gives a crap about him. Not his education, not his future. This is a society that completely neglected him all of his life. And I don't think you can have the same response to this young man as you will have to the gang leaders. Because the gang leaders didn't care about him either. The only reason they see him, they just see him as soldiers, as a foot soldier, that they can manipulate to the end, whatever that end might be. If it is around terrorizing a community for electoral and political purposes, or for some other means. So this is a kind of a complicated way of saying, I don't think you can have the same answer to the gang leaders and to the rank and files. But there has to be a strategy to bring some of the rank and files back into the society where they have some hopes. And this is going back to what's going on in Panama, Yvette, because when you look at the migrants that we saw in those videos in Texas, that's not the same as the boat people in the 80s and the 90s. No. I had an opportunity to meet with some of those folks a couple of years ago in Tijuana. They are young and educated. Yeah. It's a very different, those are people who basically saying, I can no longer make a living in Haiti. I cannot, some of them were teachers who were crossing the Darien Gap, right? They're coming from Chile, from Brazil, through Panama, through Central America, and then ended up in Southern Mexico. And then travel up from Southern Mexico to Northern Mexico. So it's a very different situation in terms of there needs to be some coalition. We got to be able to come together, as Louis DeLisa is saying. And as you're saying, Jamadai, bring them together, form this coalition, and I know, Tony, you're like, let's get to the street, but we also have to use the positions that we have. We have people in leadership politically, we have people in corporate leadership, and we have people in social, cultural, and academic leadership. They need to get involved. Not just the street, but we need to get our people from different places in position of leadership, academic, cultural, political, and social, also get involved.
Thank you, Baba Alex, for that. And you mentioned something, and when you were talking about the gang, and I'm trying to look, because when you mentioned it earlier, I think someone wrote that that's exactly, like, listening to you and how the gang positioning is used is also related to how the gang position is used in the US. You know, and I think someone had pointed that out when you had mentioned it earlier, that how the gangs get manipulated to do some of the dirty work, you know, for the government. So, you know, that is important for us to sit with. There's a little exchange Baba Louis mentioned around sort of going back to Malcolm's thinking around the UN and what has happened. And I think Zaid Mohammed mentioned the tribunal that just happened last week that also is picking up from that place. So there needs to be, one of the things that's always striking is that in the world platform, you know, we talk about human rights, and, you know, other countries hold up that policy in the decade. What's been interesting is that the US has not necessarily, we in the US who are believing in the UN's decade of people of African descent have uplifted that, but the government itself, the US's position with the UN has not uplifted that. So the human, I'm always struck that the human rights conversation becomes something that the US can criticize others, but we don't do enough self-reflection around our own human rights practices.
Yeah, so I wanna agree with Alex. I wanna expand on the street metaphor, and that in the sense that, you know, we need a united front from all sectors of our experience, you know, and societies and work where we are. We have to consolidate that, and we have to organize, and we have to understand that it is through the political pressure and creating consequences that's going to happen. You know, as Alex pointed out about that young boy in the rank and file in Haiti, is that it has a relationship to that in our community as well, because there is a distant relationship in our communities in the United States with those professionals and those people who are on the ground who would do the same thing here. You know, and so we have to build a united front to bring in those sectors, but for people to do what they can, but within that a structure, but we have to be in the streets in the sense that we have to take it to the various political entities, whether it's local, state, federal government, or some of these institutions or corporations that have resources to get them to change those policies and procedures that not only deal with our oppression here, but the oppression, you know, abroad in terms of the African diaspora.
Let me add something to that, if I might, to Yvette and Tony. I remember as associate director of the Trotter Institute, we did some work with young folks in Boston, and it was enlightening to me. So we're sitting in this focus group with these young people, and this young woman was in tears, right? And she was saying, look, adults just don't get it. Teachers don't get it. So the whole idea was around school enrollment, school, you know, attritions and absenteeism and so on. And this young woman was like, look, there are days where I cannot go to school. If, you know, I live in one neighborhood, I go to school in another neighborhood. If those two neighborhoods are at war, I cannot cross to go to school. So I have to stay home. So this is in a way saying that those are transnational issues affecting our diaspora. You know, it's very similar to this young boy who's like, look, I've been staying here. You guys keep going back on, you know, on your nice car every day. I'm not going to be asking you anymore. I'm going to, you know, block the road, and I'm going to take what I can. So I think there's a lot of similarity on those situations where these young women were just like, and then, you know, a kid down the street, I remember that clip vividly, a kid gets shot in the school, near the school. That kid cousin is the school right in New Roxbury Crossing on the top of the hill. I don't remember, I think it's the Tim, I don't know, I don't remember the name of the school.
Timothy.
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 The kid got shot in front of the school. The cousins was there, and they had to take the MCAS the next day. There was no counseling. I mean, they were just like, then they expect these kids to go into the classroom and take a high-stake exam. So, I mean, is this kind of situation where that's a cost, the diaspora?
And I want to raise two things that you mentioned, piggyback on that, but you mentioned something that I think that we need to start putting out and changing the narrative that people are leaving and migrating to the US when you're seeing all these people of African descent, these Haitians, that they're not educated and they're coming to get something. And what people don't realize is that these are very educated people that are having to leave, that there's not this sort of, oh, they're gonna come here and they're coming with nothing. Just like when they dragged us on the ship, we were on that ship as teachers, as creators, as developers, as artists. And the same way is that the folks from Haiti that are trying to seek something more stable are also people that are coming with more education. But I also want to take it directly to, and Alex, and you bringing that up around Boston, is that same lack of humanity that the world stage presents towards Haiti is the pain and trauma that you find with Haitians in the streets of Boston. The younger Haitian people that I have worked with throughout the years have been so bombarded with such negative images about Haiti to the point that they hide themselves, they cover themselves. And I've gone into schools and done trainings and people making horrible jokes and young people be like, oh, I'm just Haitian. I'm like, no, you're not just Haitian. Like, lift your head, you are Haitian, and having them understand what that means. A lot of our young people are not being told their true history. A lot of Haitian kids are not being told their history about how they should be walking through the streets of Boston with their head up high because they have something to do. That island, their people have something to do with every Black person that's walking in the world free. So we need to understand that the impact and that lack of humanity, the lack of inclusion that you spoke of, also extends into our modern day Haitian communities, especially those in Boston who are being bombarded. Like, I have gone to trainings to do Afro-Latino trainings between Dominicans and Haitians, and have Dominican students laugh and say, oh, you're behaving like a Haitian, and have to go, what does that mean? You know, so our young Haitian people in the streets of Boston, in the Boston public schools, are really struggling with that extension of that negative identity that we see on the world platform into the streets of Boston. Baba Lewis, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Sister Modestine. The reality that I'm facing is that the image of Black people, African, and those in the African diaspora, you regenerate around Haitians, but it's still there for all Black people, and that our system continues regardless of what we're doing in Black Lives Matter and all this awareness is coming about, because there's a deliberate effort not to teach the history, not to let us know who we are and why we are. And so it's more exacerbated upon groups that are coming in, but you can see among the Somalians, you can see it among the Cape Verdeans, you can see the amount of violence that's taking place, and just among African Americans themselves. But I think that that calls on us in the leadership position to one, challenge our leaders in political positions to say, we want history in our schools taught, we want civics in our schools taught, we demand the right to be able to go and speak in these programs where our young men and women are, or to be a part of these programs. I remember the West, I remember the East, I remember these programs that Campbell and other people in Brooklyn, when they trying to shut down the schools, we started independent schools. We had a lot of places young women and men could go and learn about who they were. And so there was a small turnaround at that time. But whether they turn around or not, it's still incumbent upon us to go to the Congressional Black Caucus and say, you need to stand up for what's going on in your community. You need to stand up for what's going on in Haiti. You need to stand up for what's going on in Cuba. You've got a block. Now, when we started, there was 15 members in the Black Caucus. Now there's 53 members. We got 2 senators. There are things that we have to now push on. We've gotten comfortable. And I think we have to get away from this comfort base and demand that we move forward, that we go to all these Black schools throughout the South and throughout the North where we have Black students in law school and say, you can do something that'll be historical. Put together the petition, put together the challenge to the World Court to look at what they've done to Africans, the African diaspora, look what they've done to the indigenous people of the Americas, because there's an issue that they can't get away from. In my time in Brussels, we had a block of a Caribbean African group right there as part of the EU. But they never took up any issue to say the EU is still despairing Africa, still taking out resources and minerals from the Lake Victoria area, still pushing the war during the whole time Rwanda, Burundi situation. No one from outside came and said, you can't have 2 standards. We stood by and watched almost 1 million people killed in Rwanda and Burundi in the Great Lakes. And the minute they had a skirmish in Kosovo, all of our resources went there to talk about their humanity. Mm-hmm. We have to be the change. And so I'm calling on the academic community who generally leads this to continue to do what they used to do, because I remember when Tony used to go to jail just to make a point. And I'm glad you're not doing it now, training another group. But it was always encouraging to know that somebody was going to stand up for who we are and what we are. And it did make a difference. And when you look at throughout all the police forces and everything that's going on now, there are changes that took place because we felt strongly about who we were. Charles Sharp, who's head of the Black Emergency Managers, every place he goes, he says, you're not going to solve issues of emergency management, of responding to disasters or anything else until you give Black people who are the victims of these changes or these impacts an opportunity to work with their community. Because you know what? We do it best. And so that's the challenge for us. How do we get in and push ourselves in and stay there? And then, most important of all, how do we tell our children? Because I think we forgot to say to some of our young people, here's how you got here. It looks easy. You get to these universities and corporations, but somebody struggled for you to get here. So I mean, as an emergency manager, we were on the streets handing out masks on the corner of Blue Hill and Warren Street before the governor understood what this was, because we understood from Africa and we understood from Asia and from our contacts in Europe, this was a real virus. To the day, it took them 6 months to allow testing to begin in Roxbury. There's no difference in what they do here and what they're doing in Africa or what they're doing in the Caribbean and Haiti. And if we don't stand up and have a process and demand our fair share, $100 billion that the state of Massachusetts get, and nothing has come to Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, same situation as Haiti. We're just a colony being mistreated. When it does come in our fair share, we make sure we share with our brothers and sisters in the diaspora.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm gonna hand it over. Karina.
Okay.
Solo tenemos, si lo puedes hacer rapidito, porque ya estamos terminando. Siga.
Sí. Te estaba escuchando y me viene a la mente el contraste que existe entre la atención a los haitianos que llegan a las costas de Cuba buscando migrar para Estados Unidos y las olas del mar lo traen hacia acá, y cómo se trata a los haitianos que tratan de cruzar la frontera en Dominicana, ¿no? Y entonces yo me pregunto, estaba viendo que cómo nosotros pudiéramos, cuáles son los retos que tendrían los gobiernos emisores, de donde salen estos migrantes, y los gobiernos que recepcionan esos migrantes. Estamos viendo una falta total de humanidad, de asistencia social y de protección a los ciudadanos haitianos. Y también me pregunto, ¿qué estrategias deberíamos implementar desde la academia, los intelectuales y académicos, ¿no?, para poner freno ya de una vez a esta forma inhumana de atención a las migraciones? Y es por eso que me motiva, ¿no?, lo que tú decías. Y para terminar, sí quiero decirte, ¿no?, el aporte que hay en Cuba de la Asociación Nacional de Haitianos y sus descendientes, y el importante rol que tienen ellos para la preservación de las costumbres y tradiciones de Haití en Cuba. Esencialmente en Guantánamo es donde más asentamientos haitianos hubo en el tiempo de las plantaciones. Entonces de ahí eran las dos preguntas que tenía, o sea, ¿qué retos nos quedan y cómo podemos enfrentar ese flagelo que está sucediendo ahora mismo en Estados Unidos? Ya estoy viendo lo que pasa en Boston, lo que está pasando en Dominicana y el contraste de cómo que se atienden a los haitianos acá y cómo acá lo que me dicen nada tiene que ver con la realidad cubana. Nada, para Cuba decirse descendiente haitiano es un orgullo.
So she was sharing around the contrast around how it looks when Cubans get to the shores of, how Haitians get treated when they get to the shores of Cuba is such a difference with what they see, how Cubans are treated when they get to the shores of the US and in other parts. And that what is the challenge that we need to do for that lack of humanity and lack of social consciousness to shift, because that is it's a deeply rooted disconnect. And she said for a Cuban to be told that they're of Haitian descent or connected to Haiti, it's almost one of the most proudest things you could tell them. So, you know, that within itself, that's how I think. And I think we need to start honoring that, you know, when people see my name, when I was in Haiti with my dear mentor, Anne-Marie Coriolan, who died in the earthquake, and people would be like, oh, she's Haitian. I'm like, okay, like, you know, like I'll take it. And especially with my French name from my Martinican side, but I was like, no problem. And they were surprised that, you know, I was so easy in my receiving. So I want to hand it over to the elders. It's at 2:58. I'm gonna give it to you so you could close us out, but it's been a pleasure. I think we've had a grounding conversation today as usual. I'm hoping that people leave here today with a new narrative, a new energy, a new thought process of how we see ourselves in Cuba and Haiti. And I'll close with one thing. My mentor in Panama, Corral Richards, always said, what we don't realize is that when we were dragged onto that ship and we were dropped off, we were not dropped off in our full family structure. The father may have been dropped off in Haiti, the mother was in Cuba, the son was in Panama, the other person was in New Orleans, the other person was in North Carolina. So if we can understand that we don't know who we're sitting before, but that we understand that we are connected. And that someone in this call today is connected to someone on a deeper level other than we just came together. As people of African descent, we need to start seeing each other, because if we can't see each other, then outside of us cannot see us. But I think it goes back to what Mama Joy said about we are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones that need to take care of this. So I'm handing it over to my mentors and elders to take us out.
Thank you so much,
you so
Yvette. I really want to thank all of our participants today for your contributions to the program in exploring both the complexity and our complicity in this complex struggle that is continuing to go on, and the responsibility that we have in moving forward. I think it was a very rich conversation. We will continue with actions as we're going to move forward over the next few months. Thank you, Professor Joyce Hope Scott and the Boston Pan-African Forum for sharing this platform with us, to Dr. Kantav, to Dr. Karina, and to the Reverend Dr. Elisa. I thank you all for being with us, and hope that you will join us again at our next collaborative event, which will be on January the 17th, as we celebrate, as you see behind me, the annual commemorative program. It will be the 24th annual Martin Luther King Jr. Amilcar Cabral commemorative program, January 17th. We hope that you will share that with us, and I thank you for joining us today.